What is up, Flutter devs? In the last video, we talked about the web with its document-centric APIs versus Flutter with its general user interface APIs. We looked at how the web for the last 30 years has been trying to turn a document into a user interface, and that's why web development has been kind of a living hell for 30 years. Flutter, on the other hand, is a generic user interface, but it begs the question, what can we do in Flutter if we want to actually deal with documents? What we're going to do today is we're going to talk about why Flutter does not currently support documents. At least it doesn't have the building blocks for documents built in. We're going to talk about why that is. And then we're going to talk about how I would solve the problem if I were to try to solve it. So let's get started. Let's begin. There's two sides to documents. There's viewing documents and then there's editing documents. Both have interactions. Here we have some selected text. And as you know, if you visit any web page, you can select text even if you can't edit that text. So in Flutter, we do have a widget called selectable text, which does this exact job. It gives us text that we can paint, and then we can select that text. But there are some inherent problems. On mobile, actually, let me back up just one step and let me set the context here. The fundamental kind of original cause for the limitations of Flutter's text and/or document-based interaction is that Flutter began with a specific focus on mobile. Even though today Flutter goes to web, Mac, Windows, Linux, in addition, of course, to Android and iOS, even though people are loving Flutter on these desktop platforms and rectangle sizes, Flutter was originally focused just on iOS and Android. And that's because Flutter needed to prove itself. Flutter needed to succeed somewhere before Flutter could succeed everywhere. So Flutter made Android and iOS development better even before it offered all of these other platforms. It's important to remember that. It wasn't all that long ago, but it's starting to feel like a long time ago. When I was on the team, probably for most of my first year on the Flutter team, it really was a mobile space. Certainly some people were investigating web at that point. There was work in that area, but pretty much everything we were doing publicly and in terms of production use cases, it was all Android and iOS. It's really just the last year or so that things have really started to pick up on the web and desktop front. In the world of mobile, Android and iOS, pretty much nobody is editing documents. I mean, even my thumbs aren't really small enough to be doing a bunch of document editing on my phone. And if people want to view a document on mobile, they tend to do it in a browser, in which case you just go to an existing website. Or you can deploy a web view into a mobile app. So there are ways to avoid worrying about this on mobile, and it didn't really hurt too many people. The much more common situation on mobile is that you have text fields. You know, whether there's a clear boundary around the text field or not, you tend to have this little input that has a clear bounding box, and you do some text things within it. And if you want to select or alter other text, that's a different text field. We have user interfaces where these things are clearly separated. They're clearly independent in the world of mobile. And so now we go back to this selectable text widget that I mentioned. Typically in these user interfaces, you can get away with putting a blob of text into a single selectable text widget, and then it supports selection like this. But now let's move away from tiny little mobile screens and let's talk about the browser and desktop. You're much more likely on the browser or desktop to have a series of paragraphs, possibly with various headers, possibly with images interspersed. You're much more likely to have a document. And then what do you do when it comes to selecting text? The first thing you might try is to have one big selectable text widget. The problem is selectable text is not a document widget. It's just selectable text. You aren't going to get list items in there. You aren't going to get horizontal rules in there. You aren't going to get images in there. You aren't going to get videos in there. It's not made for documents. It's made for some text that you can select. So you cannot represent this whole screen in one selectable text widget. That's not going to work. Okay, well then what do we try next? Well, what if every paragraph uses its own selectable text widget? It's not a bad idea, but it's not going to work. Each of those selectable text widgets handle their own concept of selection. And I'm not just talking about painting the selection. If each one of them just painted their own selection, that's actually totally fine. The problem is that every single individual selectable text widget, every single paragraph that you try to display, has its own gesture detector and its own scroll view. This is what fundamentally prevents you from selecting across selectable text widgets. Can't do it. So fundamentally, if we want to display a document as we're used to on the web, we're stuck. Selectable text is there, but selectable text does not do that job. How about editing? Well, there is an editable text widget. In fact, if you have ever used text field or Cupertino text field in your Flutter app, inside of it is an editable text widget. That's the workhorse that both of those have in common. Text field and Cupertino text field are decorations around an editable text. Well, editable text suffers all of the same constraints as selectable text. So here again, you might think, well, let's put each paragraph in its own editable text widget. Not going to work, because each of those widgets have their own gesture detector and their own scroll view. So you can't have gestures go between them. And if you try to do that, you might inadvertently end up scrolling one of your paragraphs, which doesn't make any sense. But then there's one more limitation on top of that. On mobile, and this is somewhat true for desktop, but it's much more important for mobile. On mobile, there is something called a text input client. If you want to receive input from the operating system keyboard, the iOS, Android keyboard, if you want autocorrect, if you want composing regions, you have to interface with, you have to be a text input client. The caveat is that there can only be one active text input client for your entire app at a given moment in time. In other words, there's only one widget that can interact with the keyboard at a time, which makes sense, but every single editable text is a different text input client, which means if paragraph number 1 receives keyboard input, paragraph number 2 is prevented from receiving keyboard input. That might sound okay, except once you start doing interesting things with documents like selecting across 2 paragraphs and then typing in text, the paragraph where you end your selection, like those 2 paragraphs are going to collapse down into one paragraph, and then you're going to start adding text in the middle of that singular paragraph. Well, which text input client is active? And do you have to switch between them? Very quickly, it becomes obvious that there needs to be one text input client for the document, not one text input client per paragraph. But again, editable text simply does not allow for that. Here is the setup roughly for the tools that we have available for dealing with selecting and editing text. We have selectable text as described. We have editable text as described. I also mentioned that text field and Cupertino text field are built on top of editable text. Now, selectable text and editable text both utilize a render paragraph to lay out text and query where various characters and lines of text are on the screen. Now, this might initially look like we have some kind of composition here, because that's when I mentioned we have these 2 tools, right? Selectable text, editable text. And I kind of implied those are the only tools we have available. You might look at this, you see, okay, well, there are at least 5 different things here instead of 2. Don't we have enough tools here to compose our own solution? And the answer is no, because there's actually a massive rift between render paragraph and then selectable and editable text. In other words, selectable text and editable text implement a lot of stuff in a non-compositional way. Like I would call them monoliths. Selectable text is a monolith, editable text is a monolith. Now, again, the reason for this largely goes back to the fact that in the earlier days of Flutter for mobile, there weren't many use cases that required smaller building blocks. The unfortunate part is that as Flutter has gone to bigger screens with more use cases, these APIs have not decomposed themselves appropriately. Instead, they've received a lot more internal conditional logic, and they've just kind of accumulated more and more features, and now they are two monoliths that we can't break apart. You can use render paragraph if you want, but there's really nothing between render paragraph and those higher level solutions. We're missing, I'm not a big fan of the layer metaphor, but I'll use it here for lack of a better one. We are kind of missing an entire middle layer of a text composition toolbox. We want a text and document composition toolbox, and we don't have it. There's a bunch of stuff that instead of being offered between render paragraph and editable text, it's all just pushed into editable text. This is the fundamental problem. This is why there are many text issues now on web. This is why Flutter cannot recommend itself on web or desktop for document purposes. Now, that said, that's why we have the problem that we have. How would I solve the problem if I were going to solve it? The first thing I would do is get rid of selectable text and editable text. Now, when I say get rid of them, I don't literally mean delete them from the framework. They are used by almost every app in existence. So they need to be supported, they need to be maintained. But what I mean is going forward, these would not be the basis for anything that I would do. These are monoliths. They have worked themselves into an unworkable state. You may be able to create a bunch of composition or composable pieces and then kind of replace the guts of these. But these two things, selectable text, editable text, are not going to become composable pieces. Their API is massive. They do a whole bunch of implicit things, and every Flutter app in existence is depending on those things. There's no room to break anything, which means there's no room to breathe. There's no room to refactor. These are a dead end. They did what they were supposed to do from a mobile perspective, but we're beyond mobile now. We need to move beyond these two widgets. Now remember that the website said, it said Flutter for web is good for rich applications, meaning non-document use cases. So even the Flutter website is thinking not in terms of text, in terms of documents, and we always need to think in that fashion as well. I've talked a lot about text. I'm going to talk a lot about text because most of a document is text, but that is not the only problem that we need to solve. We need to think about the bigger picture here. A document, yes, can have a paragraph, but it can also have list items, and it can have images, and it can have tables, and it can have horizontal rules. There's a lot more here that we need to be able to lay out and select and delete and edit than just paragraphs of text. So here's the principle that I would lean on heavily. Now, technically, aggressive composition is a fundamental principle for Flutter as a whole. But, as one is wont to do with principles, there are some areas where this principle is well applied, and there are other areas that are left wanting. When we think about most of the widgets that we deal with, here I've just taken a random sampling: padding, sized box, decorated box, center, positioned, align, container, material. Each one of these do almost nothing on their own, but put a handful of these together and you've got a real interface. Flutter was very good about using aggressive composition for all sorts of widgets unrelated to text, unrelated to documents. I think Flutter should rediscover that commitment to aggressive composition when it comes to text and documents. So here is how I would begin to approach this problem. Here's how I might try to break down some of these responsibilities. In the lower left, I'm not sure if you can read it with the overlay, but in the lower left, we have text, layout, and painting. The ability to lay out text, the ability to paint that text, and the ability to query where on the screen letters and lines of text actually are. That is plenty responsibility. Now, Flutter does provide that in render paragraph. But the reason I call this out is because render paragraph should be left alone. Don't add any more stuff to render paragraph. I mean, if you want to improve what it already does, if you want to make slightly more useful APIs for text layout and painting, go for it. But don't add any new responsibilities. We want Flutter to have a very robust text layout and painting solution. And then that text layout and painting, whether you're dealing with paragraphs in a document or headers or captions under an image or text in an app bar or in a drawer, all of the use of text everywhere in Flutter can use the same robust, effective text layout and painting. But if you add more stuff to it, if you make render paragraph or the text widget do more than just that one thing, you're going to make things worse for everyone. Let that responsibility sit on its own. Let's apply the single responsibility principle here. That is plenty of responsibility. Do that very well, and it's a very strong foundation for everything else. All right? Then we go to text decoration. Now, I word this very ambiguously, so you might not really know what I mean when I say text decoration. But if you think about text selection, there's actually two parts to it, but one part of text selection is drawing rectangles behind some text. Filling a rectangle with a light blue color behind text. That is text selection. And when you put the caret in there, that blinking thing, that's just a really thin rectangle filled with a dark color and told to blink. Both of those are just different ways of decorating text. Given a particular position within some text, you say, okay, I'm going to draw rectangles or circles or rounded rectangles, or you could have a little glitter effects, whatever you want. The point is, it's all just decoration of text. So offer an easily customizable, configurable text decoration solution. Make it easy to decorate text however you want. I don't want to try to predict all the ways that many of you out there might use that ability, but let me give you just one example about how this clears a path for the future. Imagine that you create a document editor where multiple people can edit at the same time, where you might have multiple text selections and multiple carets at the same time. Well, if text decoration, if that's truly its own responsibility, and if you can decorate any text however you want, it's a complete non-issue to have multiple selection rectangles and multiple carets. Also similar to a code editor where you have multiple carets, you select the same text over and over again, multiple places. That's easily possible as long as you have full control over text decoration. Just paint those rectangles wherever you want. That again is a good responsibility all on its own. Then let's talk about selection. Selection is mostly a logical concern, not a visual concern, not an interaction concern, a logical concern. You have a document with images, headers, paragraphs, list items. How do you represent a selection inside of that document? If I drag across that document and I'm selecting images and paragraphs and list items, how do you represent that? That's what you have to solve in selection. I'm not going to tell you how to solve it. There are many ways you could solve it, but that's something worth solving in its own right. Figure out how to represent and store and mutate a selection of a document. And if you consider that there is text inside of that document, what you're really probably dealing with is two different levels of selection. There's the document selection, and then there might be selection within a piece of the document, like selecting between this character and this character in a paragraph. So there's the document level, and then there's the paragraph level. Whatever that model is, whatever those relationships are, that's worthy of its own responsibility. Go figure that out, make that part work really well. And then we get to user interaction. Remember that one of the key problems with selectable text and editable text in terms of trying to use one for each paragraph is that they baked the user interaction into the widget. The scroll view and the gesture detector were both baked in. That's what killed the reusability. That's what killed the composition of those widgets. That's what really held us back. Don't bake user interaction into the presentation anymore. We have text layout. We have text decoration. We have some kind of model for selection. User interaction can be its own thing, which makes use of selection, decoration, and text layout. That's what brings it together. In fact, I've demonstrated that here. Take all four of those together, and you can re-implement selectable text and editable text with those composable pieces. But because you've broken down the responsibilities, because you've created a composable toolbox, other people can build their custom version of selectable text and editable text with minimal rework. They don't have to reinvent all of these fundamental capabilities. They just combine them in different ways, which is how we do everything else that we do in Flutter, right? Normally, that's how Flutter works. We create a new stateless or stateful widget, and we recombine a bunch of existing widgets in a different way to get what we want. Well, this is one path to do that with text. But I mentioned this isn't just about text. Take those four responsibilities at the bottom, add the document model at the top. What is a document model? Well, again, if you have an image, headers, paragraphs, list items, in memory, in code, what is the structure of that information? What is your object that's holding those pieces of information? That's your document model. It could be as simple as a list of nodes. Image node, header node, paragraph node, whatever. It can be as simple or complicated as you want, but there needs to be some kind of document model. Take that document model, combine it with user interaction, selection, text decoration, text layout, and now you have a document editor. This is how I would try to break down the problem. This is how I would try to solve document presentation and editing and even text selection and text editing in Flutter if it were up to me. But now, before you launch a journey to solve these things, let me also run you through just a handful of use cases so that you have a taste for some of the stranger things that might happen. Let's make sure that you're really thinking about what it means to interact with and edit a document. Obviously, we need to be able to render a paragraph of text. But that text also needs to be stylable. Bold, italic, strike through, underline, different colors. And given that we can select any part of this text that we want, there is no guarantee that it's bold followed by italics. It could be bold overlapping italics. Now, a text span, which is something that Flutter provides, will render those spans. But when it comes to editing that text, a text span is pretty much useless. So you will probably need to create your own representation for styled or otherwise marked up text. Just something to keep in mind. We talked about text selection. Again, we could get this far with selectable text, but you need to be able to select across paragraphs. And in fact, not just select across paragraphs, but select across the entire document, including images or any other content that you support in your document. But now let's talk about some more nuanced points. On the left here, it's hard to see, but we start with an image being selected. That's why it has the blue border around it. Unfortunately, the blue border is the same color as most of the fill. But we have that blue border around the header image, and then the user presses the down arrow. What happens? Well, the image is no longer selected, and now you'll notice on the right there is a caret inserted before the very first character of the paragraph below the image. This is an interaction that you need to be able to do. Your document editor needs to be able to make this happen. Go from a selection of non-text content to a selection or a position within text content. And there's an even more nuanced detail here. Let's say over on the left, hopefully you can see this with the overlay, but we have the caret at the end of the first paragraph. Once again, the user presses the down arrow. Does the caret move to the beginning of the second paragraph? No, it does not. It moves to a position in the next paragraph that is roughly equivalent to the horizontal position that it held in the previous paragraph. So you move to the next paragraph, but you try to maintain your horizontal position. Just one of these nuanced details that everyone expects to happen when they're editing or sometimes even selecting text. And here's a fun one. Let's say you're rendering a column-based layout like a newspaper. You click over here on the left and you drag up and to the right. Does your text selection move up and to the right? Are you selecting text above where you started your tap? No. It's not merely where you tap and drag. When you're selecting document content, the document needs to understand how the content flows. And then based on the flow of the content, you take the starting point and the ending point, and you apply the document knowledge of the layout to select, in this case, down the first column and at the top of the second column. But this is a choreography between the gesture interaction, the document layout implementation, and your representation of document selection. All three of those things working together. So this is just a small sample of the kinds of things that you would need to keep in mind if you are going to solve document presentation selection and editing in Flutter. So this has now been a discussion about why Flutter does not yet support document editing, document interaction, document rendering. I mentioned that I would apply aggressive composition if I were to solve the problem. I told you what those pieces might look like to achieve, one, a more composable text system, but also a document solution. And I've shown you some of these interesting nuanced interactions that you would need to implement if you were going to create document rendering and editing in Flutter. Now with that, I have one more video coming up on this topic of documents in Flutter with a special announcement. So please join me in that third and final video, and we'll wrap up our discussion about documents in Flutter.